going to present along the following lines. Look at the context of the theory of moral sentiments and Pareto's Sociologia. I have quite a few slides there because the stuff that follows needs the base. Okay, so I have a fair bit on that context section. And the sort of the contributions of the paper are to look at this idea of non-logical action, which is a Paretian term, but how it fits in with the aspects of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments for two classes of action. Those that have the appearance of being logical, and those that do not have the appearance of being logical. We then reflect a bit on the role of Smith's famous impartial spectator. I was doing a paper on speculation and I found that I wrote the impartial speculator there once, so excuse me if there's an impartial speculator somewhere. There's a very prominent role assigned to that in the theory of moral sentiments. Really, it's a key element of trying to understand Smith's agenda for treating moral reasoning. But there's aspects and similarities between what Pareto is doing in his sociology as well. So ultimately, when you're dealing with the society as a whole, you've got to make some sort of basis for bringing things together. So he tries to do something which is similar to what Smith is doing with the impartial spectator. When I end up with really discussing the role of self-interest and general interest in society, the theme here is that the theory of moral sentiments places quite a bit of importance on self-interest in behaviour, and it's part of moral reasoning. Okay, and in that there's positives and negatives of self-interest and general interest, but the negative interests, there's devices that Smith introduces to control those things. Okay. Whereas there's a similar type of thing that occurs in Pareto's sociology. Too is interested in self-interest. Many economists don't examine Pareto's sociology because they think, oh, it's something else, it's not about self-interest. But in fact, there's a large part of the sociology that deals with self-interest. It's just that when the very strict requirements of logical action are set aside, you have self-interest pursued in a different form to what we assume in sort of rational behaviour in neoclassical economics. And then to conclude, that's the program. Just if I learn to press the button the right way. Okay, so the first thing that I was expecting was that Pareto would have reflected on the theory of moral sentiments because of the incredibly high esteem which Pareto holds Adam Smith in. This is evident from his Cours d'Economie Politique, his Manuale di Economia Politica, and his Systèmes Socialistes. There's many references to Adam Smith in there, and the many references to Adam Smith are much more favourable than many of the classical economists who follow. So he's quite critical of Ricardo, you find in his work, but and tends even to side a bit with Smith on disputes with Ricardo. So given that he then moves into Smithian territory by moving from formal economics to look at sentiment, the study of sentiment, and using his sociology to do it, you'd almost think the first place he would start would be Adam Smith, given the eminent position that he held. But that's not what happens. Pareto, throughout his sociology, does not mention Adam Smith. And this is a 4-volume work. It's not a small book, okay? It is in his judgment, his great work. It's not his manual of political economy, as most economists tend to think. And if we look at Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments in terms of the framework that Pareto develops in his sociology, it would be called a derivation. And I'll come to the terminology of derivation, but it'd be called a class 3 derivation. I'll just mention to you what a class 3 derivation is in Paretian terms. Class 3 derivation is a doctrine in which reasoning grows more complicated, it becomes abstruse, abstract, and interpretations of sentiment, abstract entities, and the will of supranational beings are introduced. That procedure may yield long sequences of logical or pseudo-logical inferences and eventuate in theories that have the look of scientific theories. Among them are counted theologies and systems of metaphysics. The types of work that Smith's trying to deal with, the concepts, the moral reasoning concepts, would sometimes fall within those categories of what Pareto was saying. So if we just wanted to take Pareto's analysis of the sociology and then apply it to Smith's theory of moral sentiments, we won't get very far. We'll just have it set aside as a derivation. But what I want to do is to look at the actual elements that are common to both. There's variations, there's difference in emphasis, and in the end those works are two quite different works, but they have common groundings. And just very quickly, Smith and Pareto both had, to varying degree, positive goals. By positive goals, I mean normative goals. That these is trying to understand the positive aspect of moral reasoning in the case of Smith, and in the case of Pareto, is trying to understand the positive aspects of a social equilibrium. Smith and Pareto both deal with sentiment and non-logical action. Now, I'm posing Pareto's language there, non-logical action, but the literature on Adam Smith will make it clear that these are quite similar, and I'll sort of extend that in this talk. And finally, there's Smith and Pareto using to varying degrees this notion of an impartial spectator. It's Smith's term. Pareto's not using that term, but he uses an external judge in a similar way. Okay, so to foreshadow the conclusion in case I talk too long, there are many interesting parallels. Writing this paper was a fascinating exercise because I had to firstly get on top of Adam Smith much more than I had previously been, and that was a very enjoyable thing, and liaising with Rogério and discussing these issues was enjoyable. And nonetheless, the differences are really substantial. So with the theory of moral sentiments, we have the writings of an idealist who gave an expansive role of the impartial spectator in moral reasoning. Now, Smith scholars are likely to be objecting to my use of the term idealist in Smith because that was a criticism that was raised against Smith when the Adam Smith problem was being introduced, his theory of moral sentiments with an idealist work. I've retained it for the point of reference with Pareto. There's certainly a lot of idealism, and it's facilitated through a very, very expansive role for the impartial spectator in Smith's work, which is much, much reduced in Pareto's work. So this is why you end up with a different set of conclusions. And in sociology, we have the writings of a person who's an equilibrium theorist. He's trying to say economic equilibrium is itself a partial phenomenon. That is not partial equilibrium a la Cambridge, but general equilibrium of Leon Bourras and Pareto is a partial explanation of the whole economic and social relations that exist, because it's predicated on strict definition of logical action, of rational action, we use the term today. And he's suggesting that when you look at other influences, you have to still do that in a way that is positive and recognises that sentiment is a key device in persuading people to do things. That is, he's trying to say that people are in the business of persuading other people, politically or otherwise, to do what they want. And that's sort of a device which is not included in his general equilibrium theory in his economics. Okay, so here's some context. Smith characterises people as having sympathy for others, so a basic starting position is that individuals are social and they can place themselves in the situation of other people and make judgments of it, if you like. They can have a sympathy for another person because they can put themselves in that person's shoes. And in that cases, he sort of then talks about it in the context of three broad passions. So the unsocial passions might be hatred and resentment, things which are not going to encourage social engagement. There's the social passions, which he links to the beneficence of human action. Generosity, mutual friendship, these foster beneficence And people who would write about Smith as a sort of a virtue ethicist in this work would tend to be pointing to this place accounted to beneficence, that is, it's ranked quite highly. But lastly, there's the selfish passions, the sentiment or desire to act in pursuit of your self-interest, which is linked there to the idea of prudence. So you have a very large development of this notion of sympathy that is multifaceted, selfish, social, but also unsocial passions. Smith's agent weighs up the passions and considers what's to be the implied view of a sympathetic, impartial spectator. Now, Smith really has two dimensions to the impartial spectator, so it's conceptually set up as a device to show that there's distance from the activity that's being done. So when there's a judgment of the moral activity that's individual are being undertaken, you can be judged impartially by having some distance. So the impartial spectator may be a person removed from others who has enlightened reason and as we'll see later, is doing the work of God. You know, the type of step back, you're not in the heat of the emotion, you can take a step back and become impartial. The probably more important sense of it is that's a first step. There's this third party out there that's become impartial, but this becomes virtual, becomes internalised. That is, the agent, when they think, says, well, what would I do if the impartial spectator was there? So there's an internal element to the impartial spectator. In moral reasoning, we seek to do what we think the impartial spectator would want us to do. And the impartial spectator's role in this case is to set the standard for moral action and to judge action in regards to two criteria. You know, when you're talking about utility maximising individuals, etc., we have one criteria and one maximising and one calculus, and that gives us economics. Here we've got two criteria. The first is propriety, and the second is merit, which is really an early version of what you'd consider utility. So people who want to argue that Adam Smith is actually a pre-Bensonite utilitarian would argue that merit is very, very important in his thinking. And although there's clearly a role for propriety, so people like Samuel Hollander have said his consideration of issues that go beyond merit is no different to David Hume or others who might be more typically associated with this early utilitarian thought. So some people are inclined to argue that he's fairly close to a utilitarian thinker and others not. Now Pareto, in his sociology, takes a slightly different path. He looks at saying, what are the three common aspects, if you like, of social behaviour? There's got to be some objective aspect that somebody can independently verify by observing. There's a subjective aspect because individuals have to process things and do things for a reason. There's reason, and that has to be judged in terms of themselves. And then there's the state of mind, which he's calling the aspect of utility. Okay, so there's no aspect of propriety. In Pareto's sense, these first two aspects are being considered as how they relate to utility. So his work is more closely utilitarian than his sociology is more closely utilitarian than Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Now, this is the stage, if we're in a Pareto audience, the Pareto scholars would be falling off their chairs. Because in economics, the great contribution of Pareto, or original contribution, is to attack utilitarianism, to take away any suggestion that you can compare utility between people. So intercomparison of, there's no bridge is the term that he uses. As the English say, there's no bridge to compare utility, and the idea that you can have a measure, a quantity of utility is for him replaced by the fact of choice. You observe from choice if a person prefers A over B, and this leads to the development of ordinal economics. So the economics of rational choice has its origins in Pareto, which is a move away from utilitarian thinking. So there's a bit of an interesting curiosity that Pareto in his sociology has more in common with utilitarian thinking than he does with his economics. So when he does all this, he tries to place his book, his 4-volume book, into a series of theories. Theories of residues. Now, residues are simply observable sentiments. The sentiments may be, to behave well or whatever, but you've got to have some sort of modification, some form of manifesting them. So he's trying to be a positive scientist here and saying, how do you observe them? Theories of derivations are doctrines, social doctrines, economic doctrines, policy doctrines. Economics is a doctrine. Why do you study the history of economics to Pareto? Pareto says you study the history of economics so you can create your sociology. You actually study the doctrine, remove it, peel it back of all logical elements, try and remove all the logical elements that's there and say, what's left? What's left is a residue. It's the sentiment which is inspiring the type of analysis that's being pursued. Okay? This would be the case of his analysis of anything. The thinking world has sometimes said to regard Pareto as the enemy of the thinking world because his data are doctrines, and you try and look at the weakness in logic in there to reveal what sentiment is motivating what's being done. So this is his methodology. He's not using the concrete deductive method you use in economics, assume people are rational and seeking to maximise welfare, and you have a theory that comes out of it. You're using data, which is texts, and analysing them to try and get your sentiments out of it. When you put it all together, it culminates for him in a theory of social equilibrium, which is his goal. Okay, so his goal is different to Smith's. Smith's goal is a goal to shed light on the process of moral reasoning. Pareto's goal is to shed light on social equilibrium, including the way that doctrines are used in derivations to persuade others. Okay, now this is I like this quote from Sam McLure. It says that Smith sets out in the TMS to explain the principles humans actually, as a matter of fact, use in making moral judgment. This is, he insists, a matter of fact, not right. Okay, so the starting point here is you have fundamentally a program which is trying to be positive. Okay, there's not an objective to start out and say these following issues are what are right. It's not a normative advance. He's trying to provide a framework in which moral judgments occur and understand those as a matter of fact. Okay, so if that's correct, the impartial spectator is something factually that occurs, that people try and think, what would a good person do in these circumstances when they behave? Pareto too is a positivist, perhaps in a more uncompromising phrase than Smith, in that he's an advocate of what he calls a logical experimental method. The only thing that counts is what you can observe, and you have to rationalise it or reject it based on what you can observe. There's one exception to that when he gets into policy in the Sociologia, which I'll come to it later in the talk, because he starts using devices similar to the impartial spectator in that process. There's a quote here from Maria Pia Paganelli and Fabrizio Simon. It says, Smith's agent is not guided by utility maximisation, but by sentiments that are not necessarily rational. I'll let that sink in. You're probably thinking, well, sentiments are neither rational or irrational. Sentiments are just sentiments. Rationality is usually based on the judgment of action taken to achieve some sort of end. I think it's pretty clear what this is a shorthand way of saying is that in the case of Smith, they're not, in the theory of moral sentiments, a utility maximising agent because they've got not only utility to consider in the form of what he's calling merit, they've also got propriety to consider. Okay, and it's that which means the simple means-ends relationship by which rationality determines doesn't capture all that Smith's trying to achieve, and as a result you have something which doesn't come up in a rational sense. Now Pareto's sociology, but again not in his economics. His economics is the study of rational action. In his sociology, he's trying to examine what happens when action, in his language, is non-logical. I should stress here that non-logical, and he stresses it, is not illogical. He's not trying to say that people are behaving illogically, just that human beings are social animals, they feel for others, they act on instinct to a certain extent, they take into account a whole range of issues that means the means-ends, the logical means-ends nexus conditions can't always be met. Okay. And perhaps I'll give some clarification of that later. Now let's look at this question of non-logical action in the case of Adam Smith through this quote, because it becomes useful for understanding why utility maximisation doesn't apply in the theory of moral sentiments. It doesn't exclusively apply. So Smith's got this distinction between, I'll try that, between efficient cause and final cause. Okay, and it's this distinction which is leading to the reason why things are important. So in every part of the unit, we observe means adjust with the nicest artifice to the ends which they are intended to produce. So we're heading along that line towards something which is really going to give us a logical outcome. He says, but we still distinguish the efficient from the final cause. So that previous statement implies that there's an efficient cause that you might be able to observe. There's an appearance of an efficient relationship. But we are led to advance those ends which a refined and enlightened reason would recommend to us. We are very apt to impute to that reason, as to their efficient cause, the sentiments and actions by which we advance those ends. Now this is where the question of propriety is coming in. The actual end that's being pursued may have a subjective element, but and have objective outcomes, but it's going to be motivated by propriety as well. And the propriety is the idea of the motivating cause, not the maximisation of utility at the end. So, as I basically said there, efficient and final causes, the merit tends to be associated with the efficient cause, and merit is very clearly the benefit, the usefulness, the old meaning of utility, something's useful. And it's also consequential, that you get some outcome, and what's the consequences of it, so it's philosophically consequential. And propriety is about moral sentiment, given by enlightened reason to devise the wisdom of God, which comes from that previous slide, which is related to the final cause, the ultimate cause of why you're going to act. So that, when all that's put together, Paganelli's comment about the non-rational side comes fairly clear, I think. The world judges by the event, that's the merit of the outcome, and not by design, which concerns propriety. And this has been in all ages the complaint and is the great discouragement of virtue. So it's an enlightened reasoner is going to think of these issues of propriety, of this enlightened reason, and that action will be undertaken on that basis. Now, this is almost a footnote. If we take Pareto's sociology and put it aside for a moment, the curious thing is that the whole system that Smith is developing in this theory of moral sentiments can be readily accommodated within Pareto's work. It's not so readily accommodated in the sociology. And let me just illustrate. In his Cours d'Economie Politique, Pareto distinguishes between offerlimity and utility. Excluding Rogério, does anyone have any idea what this offerlimity might be? Okay. So, for him, offerlimity is the net pleasure from rational action that broadly corresponds to Smith's merit. So it's just the pleasure that you experience from undertaking an action. Okay, so Edgeworth talked about a pleasure machine that maximises pleasure. This is the sort of concept that he has involved with homophility. He does not like this because he insists that utility implies usefulness, and there's no suggestion that this is useful. You could be getting pleasure from vice and all sorts of things that are fundamentally unuseful. So he just wants to take a step away from the utilitarian baggage that comes with the way we talk about economics to this day. So Homo economicus is a point in commodity space that reacts solely to economic ophilimity. So what we call marginal utility, and he would say that elementary ophilimity is the force that moves the individual in commodity space. This is the force that causes movement, economic movement. And so the economic theory is predicated on Homo economicus that reacts only to ophilimity. But he also talks about moral ophilimity, the pleasure one gains from behaving in a moral way. Religious ophilimity, the pleasure one gains from religious observance. And in his next work, the Manual of Political Economy, he names Homo ethicus as the rational agent who responds to moral ophilimity, and Homo religiosus as the rational agent who responds to ophilimity, religious ophilimity. Utility in his work extends beyond mere ophilimity to cover what Pareto calls well-being and development. Okay, this is creating the well-being of a person. The well-being of a person may not resolve in pleasure-seeking or all pleasure-seeking. Okay, there's something about their moral development and well-being which needs to be accounted for. His problem here is that this is too abstract and too differential meaning for people to develop an economic theory of. So his economic theory is confined to Homo economicus, which is an abstraction of a real person who responds only to this economic pleasure. So the economic well-being and development is missing. Pareto then talks about economic utility and moral utility. So material well-being for the person, that captures the selfish passions and prudence of Smith, and talks about moral utility. This is like moral well-being and moral development as opposed to pleasure from behaving morally. It's about the development of a moral character. And that would relate to propriety and the approbation that one receives for behaving in a way that has propriety associated with it. So all of Smith's theory of moral sentiments actually fits nicer into particularly Pareto's Cours d'Economie Politique. I mean, it can be. Pareto's pure theory of rational action is confined to ophilimity. Utility doesn't lend itself to theory. With the Sociologia, there's a change in Pareto. It's one of those theorists you need to look at the development of their ideas. He abandoned the idea of having a rational study of Homo economicus and Homo religiosus because he doesn't believe that the method, the concrete deductive method, where you have a postulate and logical deduction from it, you get the solution and you try and verify that by observing what's in society. He doesn't believe that it holds. It'll hold in economics, he's comfortable with it, but in other circumstances that's not the case. And that's largely because of this role of people trying to persuade others, to get them to change their mind. Follow my religion, follow my political party, I'll bring justice to government. These are sort of persuasive devices that are not neutral and they have an effect. And this sort of individual-based analysis of both ethics and religion would say that that can be all set aside, and ultimately saying you can't, well, at least in the Sociologia. So he came to see sentiment as a powerful force that some people utilise to persuade others, and often to the benefit of themselves. Like, i.e., they're persuading you to impose a tax on imported goods because I happen to run
a good manufacturing industry which imports goods, and your argument will be because workers will rise, the workers will gain. You won't be phrasing it yourself; you'll phrase it in some other way. Pareto was also a very committed free trader, and found it incredibly frustrating when what he thought was the logic of free trade was presented and quite clear to everyone, but not clearly followed. Okay? So for a long period of time, he was advocating for these things, and so he came to the conclusion that when it comes to a fight between reason and persuasive powers based on self-interest of a subset, Pareto's the actual guy who talked about, you have a 1% levy on incomes that gets paid to a small group, and that can be billions, or millions of pounds to the small group, but the cost to everyone is very low. This was the device that he was concerned, and we often hear with, I suppose, public choice economics is a theme in that. So that's what he's essentially led him to turn to a sociology that accounts for that powerful force. And in that place he felt that the non-logic was important. Okay, now I'll be toning back on all the slides in a minute because I think this is all really the context. Pareto's non-logic, and Pareto has action in two classes. Class 1, which is logical action, and Class 2, which is non-logical. So Class 1 basically says the objective end and the subjective purpose are identical. Or if they're not identical, they're perfectly conformed. I think a just distribution of income is X. You make the changes, you achieve that just distribution, and you don't change your mind. In other words, the subjective intent and the objective outcome are perfectly conformed. Okay. Distribution of income is not his example because he would argue that typically falls here. But the point is that there's an identical element, so there's an objective element and a subjective element, and so a means-ends nexus can be taken between the end when these two are taken, and that means-ends nexus is logical. In non-logical action, he has a lot more, genus 1, 2, 3, and 4 under different categories. So they both have actions, and they both have an objective element, or they may have an objective element, and they may have a subjective element, but they don't perfectly conform. What he regards as most important are these two. Genus 2, which is the case where there's no objective outcome, but there is a subjective outcome. And that case would be a religious case. So I want to go to heaven, and this is going to be the basis of my behaviour to go to heaven. You can't verify whether you get to heaven or not objectively, so the subjective end, but there's a means to that end involve labour and effort and change behaviour. So there's objective means to the end, if you like, but there's not an objective end in itself. The objective end is subjective. The other one is metaphysics, that there's a notion of justice, the truth. These are other things which he would contend don't have a defined, unique objective end, but they can be expressed subjectively. In genus 1, they'll emerge into genus 2. So in this case, we don't have an objective end or a subjective end. It's just very rare, that's why it's being ignored, and what typically happens is they merge into this category. Objective 4, you have an objective end and a subjective end, but they're not perfectly aligned. Okay, and so in Pareto's scheme, non-logical action gives the appearance of logical action if the end is accepted by the agent ex ante and ex post. Okay, so you don't actually know what the final outcome is. You make your decision on an assumption about it, but when you get there, you accept it. So if you're observing what's going on, it can be seen as if it's a logical action. In Smith's scheme, this would be accepted. The end would be accepted by the agent ex ante and ex post if there's no irregularity of sentiment. So the term that Smith's using is whether sentiments are irregular or whether they're regular, or whether there's no irregularity in sentiment. He uses that phrase. And this case is, when you've got the quote I had earlier about there's this appearance of things aligning into a logical means ends, a logical relationship, and it's human to think that it's your own, command of logic and pursuing ends that give you this outcome, when in fact there's something deeper that's motivating it. That would be this category here of non-logical action that has the appearance of being logical. So our aptness to impute an efficient cause leads us to depend on the regularity of sentiment. When there's an irregularity of sentiment, however, the end of action can be rejected by the agent once they know it. There's an unintended consequence and you don't like it, and you would not do it if you could change your mind. And this is something that Smith is concerned about. So this is where Smith discusses the piacular feeling, and his example is the distress you would feel unintentionally killing somebody. Okay? It's not your intention. There is no reasonable basis for expecting your actions to kill someone, but having killed someone, you would feel a moral person would still feel very bad about it. This is particularly important because this leads to an irregularity of sentiment, because when you've gained that, where you started from, your ex ante view is going to change when you get to the ex post circumstance. And so the outcome will have the appearance of being non-logical. Okay, so in regard to regular sentiments, in Pareto's category, genus 2 and genus 4, where sentiments are regular, there is the appearance of a means-ends nexus. If there is an objective outcome, it would be accepted, even though it's not strictly logical, that not perfectly conform to the subjective intent. And if there's not a subjective outcome, it may not be. It may be accepted, even though there's physical activities undertaken. But is it judged in terms of utility? No, not utility alone, utility and proprietary. With Pareto, if you went through the same list, you'd say exactly the same to question 1, exactly the same to question 2, exactly the same to question 3, but when it comes to the final judgment, it's only in terms of utility that you'd make the judgment, not in terms of proprietary. So there's a difference there. If you look at irregular sentiment, you'll end up with the same situation. That is, Pareto's going to, that they're both going to give the appearance of looking non-logical. The means-end connection will not be correct. If there is an objective outcome, it'll be not accepted. You don't want to accept the death in the case of Smith, or you don't want to accept the outcome in Pareto's analysis. And if there's no logical outcome, you won't want to accept it. So this is where metaphysics comes in for Pareto. What is justice? The answer is, for Pareto, you'll set up a system which you think is justice. When you arrive there, a good chance you're going to turn around and say, well, actually, it's not as just as I thought it was. I think we need to do more work. And that would be consistent with Smith. But the last point about whether it's judged only in terms of utility won't be the case for Smith, but it will be the case for Pareto. But we need to now qualify that in the case for Smith. The qualification is that there's an interdependence between merit and proprietary. When there is this irregularity, Smith accommodates change in what constitutes propriety. That is, if you suddenly find out that there's killing people occurs from this type of action, you're going to change it. Now, some Smith scholars point out that what Smith is doing here is allowing for an evolution of the fundamental principles of propriety that occurred. That is, once correct, they're not going to be fixed forever. Society evolves, and so too does that understanding of it. The curious thing is that the justification of that is utilitarian. That is, why do you allow for this notion of propriety to change? And the answer is because it's useful for society. Society evolves. So there's two lines you can have here. You can say that, well, this means that Adam Smith is actually utilitarian in this case of irregular sentiments, because when there's a need to change the propriety question, it's justified in terms of utility. So basically, it means that there's an interdependence between utility and propriety when sentiments are irregular, and how do you account for it? And your conclusion, whether or not Smith's utilitarian or not on those, will depend on how you treat that interdependence. Okay, I've lost track of time. I'm probably...
It's 50 minutes.
Is it?
Yeah,
okay.
roughly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will wrap up and leave the last bits to questions. I'll wrap up at this point. The impartial spectator. This is a quote from Smith, and I think it's important. We must become the impartial spectators of our own characters and conduct. Now, this is where the argument that Smith is fundamentally positive in trying to understand moral reasoning breaks down, in my judgment. You've got a statement which is as normative as you can get. We must become the impartial spectator of our own characters and conduct. So there's a presumption there that we have to behave in a certain way. A positive statement would say, do we let the impartial spectator affect our own character and conduct? Okay. If you contrast that with Pareto and his sociology, the sentiments we study as objective facts strictly. So, for example, we're refusing to consider whether an action be just or unjust, moral or immoral. We shall, however, examine an objective fact, what people of a given social class in a given country at a given time mean when they say that A is just. Now, that's a statement of a positive treatment of sentiments. Okay? This is not a statement of a positive treatment in sentiments. And my point here is that it's this view that there's an impartial spectator who can become internalised within individuals is the mechanism by which this idealism in Smith starts to come through, because it's not what everyone does, whereas Pareto's trying to say you have to establish it, but that is the case. And perhaps let me end it there. If there's things that are important to come through, I'll bring them out in the discussion, and perhaps on that particular question in the later discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.